Today's poem's Checking Out Me History by John Agard. It's the one poem in the collection that I don't try and read through. There's plenty of versions out there, but have a look at BBC Bite Size has got one. For those in my school, it's on the O Drive. And it is John Agard reading the poem Checking Out Me History. And what you get a sense of is his performance poetry. He's a fantastic performance poet, really lyrical, entertaining storyteller, and actually gives some of the information and ideas behind the poem in his own presentation as well, so well worth checking that one out. As for this poem, we need to be thinking about our views of history. Okay, and just as a start, I want you to look at these names on the board. So we've got Toussaint Louverture, Lord Nelson, Florence Nightingale, Mary Seacole, Dick Whittington, Shaka Zulu, Old King Cole, Nanny D Maroon, Robin Hood. I want you to pause the video for a minute and I want you to separate them into two columns. Okay, you've separated them into two columns. Here's where you might have gone with this, and let's explore one particular interpretation. Toussaint Louverture, have we heard of him or not? Generally speaking, probably not in our consciousness. Lord Nelson, quite possibly somebody that we've heard of. There are pubs named after him. He's very much etched into the British sense of history. What about Florence Nightingale, the Lady of the Lamp? I'm guessing most of you will have heard of her too. So let's tick her. Mary Seacole, starting to eke into our consciousness a little bit, but I would say that most of the British public would probably not have heard of Mary Seacole. Dick Whittington, maybe, probably a name you've heard of, even if it's just for the sort of ideas of the pantomimes each Christmas. So I would say Dick Whittington is somebody we can tick. Shaka Zulu, probably not. Old King Cole, and again, if we have to think way back, Old King Cole was a merry old soul, and merry old soul was he. Probably back to that nursery rhyme, we've got him somewhere in our consciousness. Nanny D Maroon, no, probably not. Probably not heard of Nanny D Maroon. Robin Hood, absolutely. Of all of them, he's the one I would guess that most people have certainly heard of. Right, let's have a look at this list now in a little bit more detail. Toussaint Louverture, black historical figure. What he did was he created the very first black republic, the Republic of Haiti, obviously still a republic today in the Caribbean. And actually, what's most interesting is when you juxtapose him with Lord Nelson. Now, Toussaint Louverture's acts as the first leader of a black republic are remarkable just on that fact alone. But actually also consider that he beat Napoleon. He was actually the only black leader to repel an invading European force. Okay? What did Lord Nelson do? He did exactly the same. He repelled Napoleon. He beat him at the Battle of Waterloo. So no more remarkable than Toussaint Louverture, probably an awful lot less remarkable because of the money he was given with the British Navy. And yet we've heard of Lord Nelson. We haven't heard of Toussaint Louverture. Let's have a look at Florence Nightingale. What did she do? Well, she was the lady with the lamp. She celebrated on an old note. I think she was the £20 note quite a few editions ago. Why do we know her? Well, she went over to the Crimean War and was the most famous of the nurses helping British soldiers. She was white. We've heard of her. Mary Seacole actually did exactly the same as Florence Nightingale, a black nurse who went out into the Russian snow and healed the wounded of the British armies over in the Crimea. What makes Mary Seacole even more remarkable is the fact that she was told by the British state that she could not go over because she was black. And yet her resilience, her courage, her determination to go and help is largely forgotten by British history. So again, juxtapose Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole. We've got a black nurse forgotten, a white nurse remembered, and yet the black nurse was probably the more remarkable of the two. Right. These don't necessarily pair up quite as smartly as the others, but again, going further down, Shaka Zulu and Nanny D Maroon, both black historical figures. We'll come on to those in a minute, but let's have a look at Dick Whittington, Old King Cole and Robin Hood. Those three kind of go together because actually they're more etched into our consciousness in a sort of legendary way, in a sort of mythical way. Dick Whittington, the story of the boy with his cat who went off to London to find the streets paved with gold and ended up becoming London's first mayor. Interesting, yes. Significant on a worldwide scale, definitely not. And yet he's etched and celebrated in our culture. Old King Cole. Actually, when I've looked into this, nobody really knows who Old King Cole was. Most likely he was a capitalist from around the Buckingham area who built himself a huge palace and a huge fortune. He's largely forgotten in certainty, and yet he's remembered in the nursery rhyme. Robin Hood, what do we know about him? Well, we know he probably existed in some form or another. Robin of the Hood, Robin Hood, Robin of Locksley. He's known under different names. We know that he had the enemy of the Sheriff of Nottingham. We know that he stole from the rich and gave to the poor. But actually, not that much is known about him. He was culturally significant to this country, probably, and certainly to the area of Nottingham, who celebrate him. He has an airport named after him between Nottingham and Doncaster. But on a worldwide scale, not much, and yet there are Hollywood films. Now, let's have a look at the others. Shaka Zulu, Nani D Maroon. Shaka Zulu was the greatest of all the Zulu leaders, owned an enormous empire, and was hugely respected in the Zulu kingdoms of southern Africa. And yet, he's kind of forgotten in our history, partly because he repelled British forces, but also Dutch forces and other European forces that invaded South Africa. Hugely culturally significant on a worldwide scale, yet forgotten in European-centric history. Nani D Maroon. If I asked you, have you heard of Abraham Lincoln? Yes, you almost certainly have. The American president who aimed to bring about the end to slavery. And yet, Nani D Maroon was a slave leader, an incredibly courageous woman who led the resistance against slavery in the Caribbean and led many slaves to freedom during her time. And yet, again, she's largely forgotten. We think of history in a white way. And why do we do that? Well, we do it in Britain and Europe as well because we feel we are the centre of the world. Perhaps we are the centre of our own history. We're so absorbed in Europe being the centre. Look at any map and Europe and Britain are placed right at the centre of that. It's interesting to look at maps from other countries and see how it's, I was going to say distorted. It's not distorted, it's just from a different perspective. So we see history as what is brought to us by what we learn that's relevant to our culture. Now let's expand that a bit to link to John Agard's poem. John Agard was brought up in Guyana, which is a Caribbean nation, and was part of the British Empire. Now the British Empire then became the British Commonwealth, but it's still ruled over by Britain. And what Britain did was impose upon those cultures, so think about the Caribbean, think about Africa, think about Southeast Asia, all of the countries that form what is now the Commonwealth and what was once the British Empire. The British government imposed upon them our view of history. So John Agard in Guyana learnt about Lord Nelson and Dick Whittington and Old King Cole and Robin Hood, and he mentions Christopher Columbus too in the poem. Christopher Columbus is a really interesting one because we think of him as the discoverer of the New World. It's utter nonsense. The New World was already discovered. It's not a new world at all. It's just as old as any other world. And yet we think of it as the New World because it's when the Europeans discovered it, not before that when there were indigenous native populations, people who have ancient great histories in those lands. We see it from when Europe landed, from when Europe discovered the New World. And I use the word impose that education system very carefully. It is the right verb to use because it's the British government deciding what needs to be learned in the schools right across the Commonwealth, not just in Europe. Now, us as white Europeans, we might think, yes, William the Conqueror's important, Dick Whittington's important, Robin Hood's important, Lord Nelson's important, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that actually on a worldwide scale, they're hardly significant at all. And actually history on a worldwide scale is largely forgotten and largely untaught in British and European classrooms. And actually John Agard, as a Guyanan, as a native black Caribbean man, was not allowed to learn about the culture and his identity and those historical figures with whom he would have likely identified and who would have inspired him and countless others besides, like Toussaint Louverture, Mary Seacole, Shaka Zulu, Nanny D Maroon. Okay, let's have a look at the opening to the poem as well. Dem tell me what dem want to tell me. Who is the dem? Well, them, that is the British government. It's the use of state and power to control what children learn, to control which information they have access to and which information they do not have access to. And almost universally, that was access to a white Eurocentric view of history, not the black cultural history that would have engaged and been a sense of identity to so many people. You'll notice as well John Agard's use of language there, dem tell me. What he's using is a Creole. Now, a Creole is a simplified form of a language. When we imposed upon the Empire and the Commonwealth our education system, we also imposed upon them our language. And so therefore, in order to communicate, a more simplistic form of that language was created, which is called a Creole. And there's Creoles of all sorts of different languages, but in this case, it's an English Creole. Dem tell me. Why does he use that Creole? Well, his language, as is all of our languages, is so crucial to our own identity. And we use our own subset, our own repertoire of language, which is called our idiolect. And our idiolect comes from all sorts of forms. It comes from our locality, it comes from our parents, it comes from our friends, it comes from the jobs that we do, it comes from the TV programs that we watch. All of those form the different words and phrases that we are most likely to use. And it's part of our identity. So John Agard is using his Creole, his own idiolect, using the words that he is most comfortable with, which reflect his identity. It is a poem about identity, of course. So dem tell me, and notice that repetition of dem tell me. And the importance of that repetition is that it's a continual imposition of an education system. This didn't end, it went on and on and on. And notice at the end, that phrase, dem tell me what dem want to tell me, is repeated again. We've got that cyclical structure that means that the British continued to impose this education system across its empire and across the Commonwealth. Now, in the second part, we've got two interesting verbs there. Bandage my eyes, blind me to my own identity. Now, bandage is used quite ironically there, isn't it? Because a bandage would usually be something that would heal. In this case, a bandage is used by the very state, the very government that have blinded him to his own identity. So it's quite ironic that a verb usually used to mean to heal, to bandage things up, is used to actually link to his denial of knowledge, to how he was denied that history. And so that ironic sense, that juxtaposition between blind and bandage is so crucial. But our key quote here is blind me to my own identity. Blind is quite a violent verb. It's a deliberate act. And John Agard is trying to get across to us that the British government's decision to withdraw, to deny a black historical approach is absolutely deliberate and stopped him finding out who he really was, and many, many others like him. Blind me to my own identity. So my own, again, this use of the Creole, of the simplified version of English, the idiolect that John Agard has to express his own identity. But blind me to my own identity is so crucial that he feels it was a deliberate act of a British government to stop him learning about historical figures that express a cultural history that's more appropriate and engaged for him.